Democratic Congresswoman and leader of the Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, publicly called out the media at a press conference for their lazy, false equivalences during the debt ceiling negotiations. Intrigued? Then click that like and subscribe and enjoy the video. All right, so those of you who watch my videos or have seen me in conversations with other content creators or on debate panels are aware, most likely, of the fact that I despise enlightened centrism. What is that? Well, that's the trope that suggests that between any two sides in a conflict, if they're both technically flawed, which they are, every side in a conflict in the history of human conflict has been flawed because no one's been perfect. But the idea that if you have a conflict and there are two sides and two sides are technically flawed, they must be equally flawed or comparably flawed. They must be basically on the same terrain, the same moral landscape. In politics, this is extremely lazy, it's woefully ignorant, and it doesn't reflect the facts. The idea that the left or the Democratic Party is equally good or equally bad to the right or the Republican Party is just not true. It's not reflected in the facts. The Democratic Party, for all their faults, they do better than the Republican Party. And this is, again, one of the recurring theses of the channel. And so I like it when other people remind other people of that fact, because centrism and enlightened centrism is so popular, and particularly on the internet, but even in the populace, right? Because people don't pay attention to politics. Why should they? I mean, they typically have families and jobs and responsibilities and hobbies. They probably don't have the time to dive into it as obsessively as I do. But it's important to call that out because it contributes to a landscape which is generally hostile to the left and favorable to the right. And I was out of town for the past several days, and obviously during that time there were debt ceiling negotiations and a tentative agreement between the president and Republican Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. But before that happened, a few days before, during those negotiations, there was a press conference in which Democratic Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, the leader of the Progressive Caucus in the House of Representatives, so the leader of progressives like AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, she publicly called out the media. She took a chance, got a little fierce, got a little feisty, which I love, and she called them out for a question that is predicated on a lazy false equivalence and false premise. So let's play the clip. Let's hear what Pramila Jayapal has to say, and then we'll break it down.
They are willing to tank it. No. Sorry. That is exactly the problem, is when the media reports this as not their fault. And I'm just going to say, I know so many of you, I have so much respect for what you do, but let's tell the truth here. We are not tanking anything. The debt ceiling has been raised because we have an appropriations process, and during the appropriations process, the budget process, we negotiate. The Republicans can try to get whatever they can there, but then we agree. No, this is important. The American people should hear this. Then we agree on spending. Republicans agree, Democrats agree, we decide, we appropriate money based on what Congress has passed, legislation that we pass in this body. That is democracy. And then, when it's time, the debt ceiling is raised to accommodate what we have already passed, Republicans and Democrats, in a democratic process.
Okay, let me just clarify.
Okay.
I read it.
Okay, that was great. That was great. And that's the kind of energy that you can expect from progressives in general. But we need that energy more commonly distributed among moderate Democrats. I would argue just moderates in general, voters, constituents, online commentators. That's the sort of factual energy that we need to see because it's true. She is debunking a false equivalence. The media does this all the time so as to not be tarred and feathered as liberal media, right? That's a notion that's been around since particularly the Nixon administration, where when the media was critical of Nixon, his then vice president, Spiro Agnew, coined the phrase liberal media, liberal media. Let's just indict or impugn the character of the media. Don't let them ask tough questions. And if they ask tough questions and adversarial questions, it must be because they're biased against the president. So whereas Fox News and others like them have just leaned into their right-wing ideology, you have the mainstream media, the rest of the mainstream media like CNN, the New York Times, whatever, where they ask these loaded questions so as to not be as easily accused of a liberal bias. And obviously we won't break into the details of the appropriations and debt ceiling process because we've covered them ad nauseum, and Pramila Jayapal covered them beautifully. But I want to focus again on her energy and how she rejected the question. Listen, you can ask me a question. You can ask me a question about what we could have done better, should have done better, but don't come to me with a false premise, a false equivalence. So you guys are threatening to crash the economy. You guys are holding the debt ceiling or the economy hostage. No, no, no. The Democratic Party agreed months ago that we would vote to raise the debt ceiling. Just send us a bill which raises the debt ceiling. But don't try to negotiate with us over it, because this is a bipartisan bill, right? The debt ceiling is a bipartisan debt. Republicans have contributed to the national debt, not just Democrats, which means Republicans have an obligation to pay that debt, not just Democrats. We can't hold Democrats to a higher expectation than Republicans. That screws Democrats every single time, and it's irrational. There's no basis for it. Why should we grade Republicans on a curve? Why should we let them get away with this stuff? No, no, no. Donald Trump added $7 or $8 trillion to the debt during his presidency, 25% of it. And during his 4 years in office, Democrats voted with Republicans to raise or accommodate the debt ceiling 3 times, 7 times under Bush, 18 times under Reagan. The debt ceiling has been raised more under Republican administrations than Democratic administrations. When it's time for you all to potentially eat the consequences of this, Democrats in good faith do our part for the sake of the national economy. But when the shoe's on the other foot, you all don't do it to help us out. And the media has an obligation to point that out unfailingly. They do not get the right, in my opinion, to ask a loaded question like that. Instead, a loaded question would be, hey, listen, I know Republicans, and Republicans alone, are threatening the international and domestic economy. But what are you going to do about it? That's a fair question. That's a tough question, because it says, listen, okay, this one side is acting in bad faith, and we recognize that. And just because they're acting in bad faith, it doesn't mean you're acting in bad faith. They're the villains of this story. But what are you going to do to defeat them? What are you going to do to stop them? Are you willing to make concessions, short-term concessions, which might embolden them in future situations, but would help save the economy now? Those are all fair, pertinent questions that the media has every right to ask. And those are tough questions for Democrats. But to predicate it on a false equivalence, hey, you guys are kind of both. No, no, no. In the story of the debt ceiling hostage situation, Republicans are the hostage. The global economy, domestic economy, they're the hostage. The hostage taker, the villains of the story, have always and only ever been Republicans. And so Pramila Jayapal was right to point that out. She clearly rejects false equivalences and both sidesism and both samesism and enlightened centrism, and so should you. In the real world, just because there are two sides in a conflict doesn't mean that they're both equally bad. In the Civil War, the Union wasn't perfect, but it was better than the Confederacy. Fact. In the Second World War, the Axis were worse than the Allies. The Allies still committed their fair share of sins and crimes, but they weren't as bad as the Axis. Likewise, if you can recognize those facts, then it should be pretty easy if you examine the political landscape now, particularly on this topic of the debt ceiling. Whatever flaw you want to ascribe to the Democrats, the fact of the matter is Republicans, the Republican Party, the Republican leadership is worse. That's the truth.